loved her stories, and they were kind of sad actually not to be able to come today and hear her talk some more. So Mary, thank you for doing this. She's a wonderful volunteer and a great sport for being willing to do this. So I'm going to turn it over to Mary.
Well, hello. A couple of things you need to know before I start. First of all, I have spoken in front of probably thousands of grade schoolers, and I still do preschool story times after 25 years, but I do not regularly speak in front of adults. So, in fact, I am standing here fighting the urge to open with hands go up, hands go down, now we turn it round and round. So, anyway, are you sitting on your bottoms? Does everybody have your ears turned on and your mouth turned off and ready to listen? That's how we start. Secondly, even when I have spoken in front of church groups or at other places, I have never before used a PowerPoint. I generally have a picture book with little pages and pictures. And so I hadn't even made any PowerPoint slides for over 5 years. I wasn't sure I remembered how. I'm very proud of myself that I remembered how to make the slides, but I've never actually used these. Now it says my signal. Now I don't know how to get going again. Oh, there it is. Yes. So you're going to have to be really patient with me. And, oh, here's me. Hello. Hello, hello. So anyway, if, Melissa said if I don't get the hang of this and I can't do it, that she will come up here and change the pictures for me, which would probably require me saying, beep, beep, every time I want the pictures changed. I think I can handle it myself. She showed me how. So anyway, by now you might have guessed that this rookie was not even the first choice to do this program. Do you remember having a substitute teacher in school and thinking, how does this person have any business at all teaching this class? That's me. That's me today. But when Sue called to ask me to fill in and she gave me the subject, I was so excited. I said, wedding traditions? You're kidding. I actually used that topic as a term paper in high school. This was my high school term paper. And I did all the research at Eureka College, at the college library there, because I had this enormous crush on one of the basketball players at Eureka College. And he went to my church, and so I thought, if I go there and I do all my research there, maybe I will run into him and maybe he will marry me. That did not happen. I married someone much shorter but much sweeter.
Amen.
But I am married, so that gives me cred. And then I did get an A on the paper. So I'm totally qualified, I think, to show all this stuff to you. I actually went downstairs in my basement to look for that term paper, thinking if I could find that, and I think I still have it, then this entire speech would be completely done. All the research, all the everything, I wouldn't have to do a thing. And I opened up I cracked the lid to the little Rubbermaid tote that holds all of our past lives. You have some of those, don't you? The ones that your kids will throw away in a few years when we're all gone. But anyway, I went to crack the lid, and it's full of so much stuff. I thought, oh, forget it. It would be easier just to start over from square one. So that's what I did. So you'll be at least relieved to know that I will not be reading to you a 40-year-old research paper. It's all new. I tried to get the research done this time from the internet, but I used reliable sources like a good librarian taught me, and Pam. And so I used reliable sources, and if several of the sources disagreed, then I just went with the best 2 out of 3. So hopefully this is all as accurate as it can be. Let's see, I guess that being that, I love history, love it. I love quirky facts. So I'm so excited to share all these weird things with people who are as excited about weird, quirky facts as I am. let's see, I guess we will begin. Let's just jump in. We are here to revel in our, oh, what's that? I changed it. In our cultural wedding traditions. But as you know, a lot of the things that we have always considered sacred are now just kind of going by the wayside. Things that have been the norm for the past 100 years or so, from white dresses to diamonds, are sort of being cast aside by a whole new generation of influencers who want to completely break away from a lot of these outdated traditions. Why would you want to break away from things like those floral dresses? I don't know. But anyway, we are going to review the traditions today that we remember and that we probably used and hold dear. Starting with wedding rings. The wedding ring was an ancient Egyptian tradition, originally woven from reeds or hemp, materials that were later replaced with more permanent things like circles of leather or bone or ivory. The Egyptians thought that the vein of love ran from the left finger straight to the heart, and so we still wear wedding rings on that finger. When the Romans conquered Egypt, they kind of liked that idea of this little circular symbol of eternity, so they adopted the wedding band into their culture. Sometimes they even added gemstones to show their wealth or their status. And at one point, they designed their rings to show two clasped hands. Can you see those two clasped hands there on the ring on the right? Well, the reason they used that design was not necessarily a symbol of love, but of agreement. You see, that's because until the 2nd century BC, Roman rings were given by the groom to the father of the bride. Not to the bride, but to her dad, to symbolize that the woman had been purchased. So she's mine now, here's a ring to seal the deal. That is also where we get our tradition of the father giving the bride in holy matrimony. Weddings were originally a business transaction, a transfer of property, and the bride was the property. The groom kissing the bride was also originally done for the same reason. Very few people were literate, so instead of signing their name to a contract, a deal would be sealed with a kiss. Prior to the 1800s, brides were primarily chosen for their economic worth. Love had very little to do with marriage. Women were needed for procreation and for household work. And there was not necessarily any emotional commitment. Marrying your cousin was also much more common to keep the money in the family. That was important. So Hallmark movie plots happened even more rarely in ancient times than they do now, if that's possible. All right, so Dad started out getting the ring as an agreement, but when Christianity was adopted as the Roman state religion and official marriages started being performed by the church as a sacrament, then rings began being exchanged between the bride and the groom, and religious images were often added to a ring. Now, as I went online, I found lots of different designs from different European countries and traditions. But one that I really wanted to mention was the posy ring. The posy ring you'll see there on the left. Posy rings became popular in the 1400s and remained popular for many centuries later. I love posy rings. I have a posy ring. That was an anniversary gift. So that's I kind of have a special place in my heart for posy rings. Posies are inscribed with a short verse or other heartfelt words on the outside perimeter of the band, as you can see there. And in the 1700s, women started wearing diamond keeper rings, like the one you see on the right, on either side of their posy bands, and sometimes even on either side of just a plain wedding band. Diamonds themselves were not used in wedding rings until the 1400s, mainly because prior to that time there were no good methods for cutting them well because they were so hard. The very first engagement ring was given in 1477 by Archduke Maximilian of Austria to Mary of Burgundy. There she is, the most eligible and lovely bachelorette of the day. It was designed with diamonds laid out in the shape of an M. Good job, Max. In the mid-1940s, a diamond mining company in South Africa named De Beers launched an ad campaign using Hollywood stars and the slogan, "A diamond is forever." And that absolutely catapulted diamond sales and made diamonds a girl's best friend and made them the top choice for wedding rings ever after. Another fact I thought was kind of interesting was that in our formerly agriculturally based society, men did not regularly wear their wedding bands until after World War I. I thought that was kind of interesting. Nowadays, we think about men getting down on one knee to propose marriage to a girl and present her with that engagement ring. Well, that gesture harkens back to medieval times when knights would kneel down as a sign of respect and loyalty, and they would kneel before ladies as a symbol of devotion. It's chivalry at its finest. Oh, it's so romantic. Just love it all. So, we've got the ring. Now we're going to go on to the wedding. So first, we pick a date. June is still the most popular month for weddings. Not only because the weather is generally lovely in this hemisphere in June, but also because in medieval times, people took their annual bath in May. So you would take a bath once a year in May. By June, you still smelled pretty good. And by June, there would be lots of flowers and herbs that were blooming, and the women then would be able to carry those in a bouquet to kind of cover up any kind of body odor that might be lingering, since the May bath. So anyway, that's why they decided that June would be a great time. There was no deodorant back in the Middle Ages, only flowers. That's all you had. So since we have chosen our weekend in June, now we need bridesmaids. We've got to choose our bridesmaids. Why? Well, let's go back to ancient Rome again, when brides were property, remember? A bride could be kidnapped, stolen, or even killed by jealous rivals, or maybe even nabbed by some random guy who actually did love her. Imagine that. Worse yet, she could become bait for evil spirits. Yes, which we now understand is simply PMS. But in any case, they would dress up a whole entourage of women in dresses matching the brides, and they would use them as decoys. That, honestly, this is true. And this would confuse any shysters who wouldn't then know which female to grab. Plus, there was safety in numbers, right? Okay. The groomsmen, get this, served a very similar purpose. They were originally a groom's bodyguards. Back in those Roman days, when men who disapproved of the marriage would literally steal the bride. So the best man was actually the best sword fighter in the whole bunch. That's how you got to be the best man. You had to be best with the sword. So this was fascinating. The reason to this day that when you go into a wedding, the bride is always on the left is because most grooms were right-handed, and the groom also had to have his sword at the ready and be able to fight off anybody who was trying to steal his property during the ceremony. So that is why the groom had to be on the right and the bride had to be on the left. And still, they are still to this day. Can you imagine these battles going on during a wedding ceremony amidst, actual battles, not just the in-laws being snarky, but battle. It's just fascinating to me. So there's the groom. He's okay. So on to the next thing. Oh, wait, I left something out. So eventually it became Roman law that couples had to have at least 10 witnesses all wearing matching colors in order to certify a wedding. That was the Roman law. Yes, interesting. Okay, next. Bing. All right, so we've got the rings. We have our wedding party chosen. Now the bride needs a wedding dress. Well, wearing white for a wedding, like we're surrounded with here, is actually a fairly recent tradition. During less prosperous eras, white was considered an impractical color because most women could not afford to own very many dresses. They needed a practical dress that could be worn again after the ceremony. Now, I looked for a practical wedding dress like a pioneer woman would have worn, and this is the picture that I found. I like the wedding dress, but the doofy groom is all decked out in white. I don't think that would have happened either. I can imagine, but it is what it is. Ignore the groom. Just ignore the groom. Look at the bride. That's kind of what we're going for. So, anyway, the wedding dress was not a once and done garment until the Industrial Revolution began, and the beginning of the white wedding dress trend, the very beginning of it was the wedding of Queen Victoria in 1840. She was the biggest influencer of her day. She wore a pale satin wedding gown that was actually champagne colored, but it looked white in all the illustrations of the day, and other brides wanted to look like royalty and to wear the same color as the queen. I did. A white dress, and it would symbolize purity and fragility, and we go with that even to this day. Victoria even had 12 bridesmaids, all swathed in that same lovely color. Bridal veils were also westernized during Queen Victoria's reign. The wedding veil is something that's been worn in many different cultures to symbolize purity and chastity. Way back in the Old Testament, you'll remember, a Hebrew wedding veil was even partly to blame for Jacob being tricked into marrying Leah instead of her little sister Rachel. Do you remember that story? So she was veiled, he was drunk, then he woke up married to the wrong sister. He was so mad, worked all those years for nothing. Anyway, but I have to share something that I found out about the ancient Roman version of the wedding veil. Get this, they also weighted them down so that the brides could not run away, as most of them probably wanted to because they were being purchased, right? So they had all these weights on their wedding veil, and their veils were brightly dyed in these fiery colors and were called flammium. Flammium, yes, that's what they were called, shown here. The flammium were not only symbols of warmth and light, but supposedly they would also scare off those aforementioned evil spirits. Just as an FYI, having flaming red hair. It does exactly the same. So, we've got our rings, check. We have got our date set, check. We've got our attendance, check. We've got our wedding attire, check. Now, invitations. I found out that if we were going to send out invitations and we were living here in this area in the 1840s, the invitations would be sent out about 1 week in advance. Weddings were usually held around noon on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, because ministers were busy enough on the weekends, and a lot of them were traveling around from place to little churches and little towns all over the place. You couldn't catch a minister on the weekends. So you went weekday, lunchtime, generally only immediate family, held at the family church or the home of the bride or groom's parents. And it was a very solemn affair. There was no music. There was no dancing. It wasn't until the opulent 1920s that caterers and cake bakers and florists and photographers and bridal wear shops even existed. So only in about the last 100 years. And look at the booming industry that has become. It is no surprise that the U.S. hosts the most expensive weddings in the whole entire world, even though half of them end in divorce. But the most expensive wedding ever recorded took place in France in 2004, and it cost $55 million. There was no mention of whether or not that couple is still hitched. I don't know. The word hitched makes sense, tethered together like horses. But what about tie the knot? Well, that expression comes from an ancient Celtic tradition in which the couple's hands were literally tied together during the ceremony to symbolize unity. A knot was made for each vow that they took, and then after the ceremony, they were given the knotted rope as a keepsake. Isn't that beautiful? I thought that was so sweet. So anyway, on to the next. One of my favorite silly little wedding traditions has always been the something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, and a penny in your shoe for luck. I made sure that I had all those things on my wedding day, and that both of our daughter-in-laws had all those things on their wedding days. Well, that little rhyme originated in the 19th century in the town of Lancashire, England. The something old is supposed to remind you of your past, and flower girls and little ring bearers are used for the same reason. The something new is supposed to be a sign of ushering in your future. The something borrowed is supposed to be from a loved one, preferably one who's had a good marriage and can pass along that good fortune. And the something blue is the color of purity and faithfulness. It might also ward off infertility, they said. And then the penny, of course, or the sixpence, as the little ditty originally dictated, symbolizes financial prosperity. So even if you don't believe in superstition, it's still fun to gather up all those things just for the sake of tradition. There are also, did I go past? Oh, I did. Okay. There are also a few other traditions that somehow became the norm in our culture, and one with the very strangest history is the garter toss. You know that garters used to be used to hold up stockings. Well, way back in the Middle Ages, couples were expected to consummate their marriage immediately after taking their vows. And I mean immediately after taking their vows. So well-wishers would decorate their marital bed with flowers and ribbons and such, and then they would escort the couple to the bed. Oh yes. And then, oh, and get this, all that bed decorating, this is the precursor to what we do now and decorate the getaway car, decorating the car. We do that instead of the bed. I think that's a much better option. Anyway, so they would escort the couple to their bed, and then some wedding guest would actually try to watch to make sure that the deed was done. Perverts. It turns out that removing a garter and holding it up as proof of reaching the destination, that was a way to hopefully get some privacy. But why throw the garter? Well, catching the garter is still considered good luck, but in medieval times, pieces of the bride's entire ensemble were considered tokens of good luck. So much so that the wedding guests would be grabbing at her, grabbing at the bride, grabbing, and fighting to rip her clothes right off of her body because they all wanted a piece of that good luck. So things would get so rowdy that couples decided if they threw a garter, guests might fight over and chase after that instead of after the bride, and thus she would have a chance to get away. So for the sake of bridal protection, the garter toss was born. So of course we also then have the bouquet toss, right? Which used to be the norm, but like the garter toss, it's now only done at about half of all modern weddings. Brides toss a bouquet over their shoulder, and whoever catches it is said to be the next one to get married. The female equivalent of the garter toss, and it shares the exact same origin as a way to give wedding guests something of the bride's attire for luck while getting them far enough away that they stop tearing apart her wedding dress. As an added perk, the flowers symbolize fertility, which all of the grabby guests wanted too. A couple of these wedding guests here look like maybe they would tear a bride apart. So, moving on. Now, long before motherhood, Jennifer and I were talking before this, we took cake decorating together in 4-H. And then I used to actually make wedding cakes for people. So I wanted to share the history of wedding cakes, even though they are now becoming less and less of an ongoing tradition. So going back to ancient Rome, a barley roll, that's what I've decided that is up there at the top. A barley roll was crumbled over the head of the bride during a wedding to promote fertility. And this sort of morphed into the medieval tradition of stacking up piles of sweet rolls and then having the bride and groom try to kiss over the top of them without knocking them down. And if they managed this, then they would supposedly have good luck and a happy life together. During the 16th and 17th centuries, bride's pie was served at most weddings instead of cake. It was a savory dish with a pastry crust, and according to a recipe from 1665, it was filled with an assortment of oysters, lamb testicles, pine kernels, and coxcombs. Yum. Fertility food, I guess. I don't know. Okay, on from that. The modern wedding cake, as we know it, originated in 1882, so it hasn't been around that long, at the wedding of Prince Leopold of Albany. That is Queen Victoria's youngest of her 9 children. Now, when I found this picture of him, does he not look sickly? I mean, he looks very unwell. So I thought, oh my goodness. And so up down that rabbit hole, I started researching him, and sure enough, he had hemophilia, so he was a hemophiliac, and He also had epilepsy, and he died at the age of 30. So he was as sickly as he looked in the picture. And so I was right. So anyway, he outlived, or Queen Victoria outlived him by 17 years. She died 17 years after he did, poor guy. So anyway, but his wedding cake was the very first to include tiers of cake, as you can see, that were quite the status symbol. Pillars between cake tiers were not used by the masses until around 1900, and they were originally made from sections of broomsticks that were cut and then covered in icing. Pretty nifty. All right. Oh, let's see. From the 17th century until Victorian times, each bride had her very own personal cake. It was usually a pound cake with white icing, a sign of virginity. The bride would cut the cake herself, handing out pieces which represented fertility to all of her guests. Meanwhile, the groom had a separate cake, which was typically a smaller, darker colored fruit cake, the fruit also being a sign of fertility plus prosperity. And these fruit cakes, blended with wine, would actually keep until the couple's first anniversary. And thus began the tradition of saving back part of the wedding cake for a year. This was supposed to be good luck in preventing marriage problems. Couples would hope to eat it to celebrate the birth of their firstborn child. Now eventually, the bride's cake became more like the large ornate wedding cakes we know now, and wedding parties grew larger too. So the groom was needed to help the bride cut her cake and distribute pieces to the guests. And then somebody apparently said, "Oh, look, he's cutting the cake with her. Oh, Kodak moment." I don't know. So then the next logical step was for the bride and groom to share a piece of cake and feed it to each other before doling it out to the rest of the people. And then feeding the cake to each other came to symbolize their promise to always provide for each other, and it made another great photo moment. Now, before I go on to that, here's a final bit of cake trivia that I thought was really neat. In the early 19th century, when brides' cakes were becoming more popular, sugar was becoming easier to get, but the more refined, whiter colored sugars were still really expensive, and only the very wealthiest families could afford to have pure white frosting. When Queen Victoria, influencer that she was, used pure white icing on her wedding cake, it gained a new title. It was called royal icing. So if you're a baker, you know what royal icing is and how it's made, but I never knew how it got its name until I was researching for this. Now I'm all excited. So anyway. All right, now we are at the reception and we're having our cake, and people start toasting and also clinking their glasses to make the bride and groom kiss, right? Mm-hmm. So where did all this clinking of glass come from? Turns out there are two possible origins for this. Both of them stem from medieval times. First, the clinking was a way to chase away any evil spirits. Kind of like me knocking on the window to chase a squirrel away from my bird feeder, right? Did you know why alcoholic beverages are called spirits? It's because in the Middle Ages, people had no clue why they started acting all squirrely when they drank. And their best guess was that evil spirits or demons actually inhabited the alcohol. And then they would slurp that little devil right into their bodies unless they would make some kind of noise first to chase it away. So the term demon rum also comes from this belief. I never knew any of this until I read. got to be, that's why they call it spirits. So, the second explanation is equally fascinating. It was quite easy to poison someone with a glass of wine because the poison would be concealed in the sediment quite well. So, if a host wanted to prove that the wine was safe to drink, he would pour a part of his guest's wine into his own glass and take a sip first to prove, I'm not going to poison you. And then if the guest trusted his host, he would clink glasses as a sign of trust and toast to good health. You're not poisoning me, cheers. So those were the two reasons, which I thought were really nifty. Let's see, throwing grain like wheat or rice at a newlywed couple has been done for centuries and centuries as a sign of fertility in all parts of the world. The thing about rice making birds explode, that is absolutely not true. It's some kind of a weird story that got started as an urban legend. It is not true at all. I think churches just don't want to sweep up the rice, but it's not true. But still, nowadays, people tend to do bubbles instead of rice. And the bubbles are a sign that after marriage, you will get rounder, and all of your hopes and dreams will just float away. That's not true. All right. One of the last wedding traditions I wanted to mention is the honeymoon. In ancient times, running away with your bride was more of a thing, especially if you were trying to keep her away from all those disgruntled people who wanted to kidnap her, or from the evil spirits who wanted to give her PMS. But later on, all that skedaddling wasn't really necessary, and it honestly was rarely done. In more modern times, newlyweds who could afford to do so might take a trip to visit any relatives who were unable to attend their wedding. And then they would stay with these relatives. That's what my grandparents did. They went to see the Indiana folks who couldn't make it here to the wedding, and then they stayed with the Indiana folks, and that was the extent of their honeymoon. So that's the closest thing to a romantic getaway that most people could afford. 1791, however, marked the first mention of a trip being taken by newlyweds for pure enjoyment, and thus the honeymoon was born. Now, entering their own home for the first time after their wedding, a groom used to carry the bride across the threshold. And like many of the traditions we've talked about, this one also stems from ancient Rome, where those evil spirits were thought to be trying to latch onto that woman one last time and ride into the house with her, and also symbolized the bride's unwillingness to leave her father's home, since to do so willingly was considered shameful. And that, my dear friends, is the end of this strange little excursion into our wedding traditions. But here's your challenge, okay? You can go down a real rabbit hole if you Google unusual wedding traditions from other countries. And if you do that, that'll entertain you for hours. You'll find out where friends and family members get to throw mud, molasses, rotten food, and feathers onto the happy couple. That was one that I found. Where they're both guarded and not allowed to use the bathroom for 3 days before the wedding to ensure a strong foundation and fidelity. And where the father of the bride spits on her head and her chest for good luck, and where the groom gets his ankles tied together and has the bottoms of his feet beaten with big sticks and dried fish while he answers riddles and trivia questions. And then the next time you go to a wedding and you're seated at the reception with people that you don't know, then you can conjure up some of these weird facts and just blurt them out, and then they won't talk to you for the rest of the reception. You don't have to worry about making small talk. Just put an end to it. So, as I say to the preschoolers, thank you for coming and for being such good listeners. And I will leave you with some marriage advice I heard from Tom Bodette just this morning. If married people would listen to each other more and talk less, eventually they could just stop speaking to each other entirely. So, thank you.